Autonomous truck technology is a big deal. For a fragmented trucking industry, the ability to assist in can be considered a paradigm shift. For an industry built upon thousands of motor carriers and millions of drivers, questions about what and how these systems will work are huge, as failing to anticipate or adjust for their debut can mean some carriers go the way of the dinosaur and become extinct. But as with most things involving regulated commerce, we need to pay attention to what regulators are thinking about and especially talking about. Will this autonomous trucking revolution be a bang, or will legal challenges mean the rollout is more of a fizzle? Well, folks, find out. It's your lucky day. We're going to figure it out in this episode of Loaded and Loaded. Loaded and rolling, I'm your host, Thomas Wasson. Now, I've talked a lot about autonomous trucks, but one thing that keeps sticking with me at least is not the dazzling technology, but what are the legal challenges? Now, it's one thing to have an AI-driven system, but it's another thing altogether to handle what happens when accidents or breakdowns occur. Can it be even more challenging to see what's going on behind the scenes at Capitol Hill, where legislatures will have an outsized impact through not only their laws and regulations, but how they're going to address the autonomous vehicle deployment. And another thing is, once they're deployed, how are fleets going to use them operationally? But we're in luck, because today, joining me again to catch up on what's been going on at Capitol Hill and what the current legal front for autonomous truck systems is Wiley Deck, Vice President of Government Affairs and former FMCSA Deputy Administrator. Before joining the FMCSA, Wiley also served over 2 decades in the U.S. House of Representatives in various roles, including Director of Oversight and Investigations for the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Welcome back, Wiley. Pleasure to have you back on.
Well, thanks for having me again, Thomas. Good to see you. Glad to be here.
There's so much to go through, and I think it's important because one thing that I've noticed is even at the FMCSA, we're seeing a lot of movement on things like meal breaks, trying to address some problems that are driver-facing. But I feel like there's not been as much talk, at least about some of these autonomous systems, which may be, looming in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct in that they started the process back when I was at the agency back in 2019 on the autonomous trucks. But what we've seen is delays in rolling out that next phase of the rulemaking process, which is a notice of proposed rulemaking. In January, the administration put out the supplemental advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is they were asking a bunch of additional questions that weren't covered in the original document, and they wanted to know about changes that have happened in the industry since the original document came out in 2019. And what we've seen is that they've also put out notices for some research that the agency will be conducting into these technologies, which may delay the release of the next phase of the rulemaking just because they may want to see this information and data that they're planning to collect and how that will shape what a future rule would look like.
And that's an interesting point because it does feel like states like California and Texas and others are almost taking point on developing some blueprints. I know California has an assembly bill that may even require drivers in these trucks. Is this something where, is that going to be taken into consideration by the FMCSA, or is this more of a legislative Capitol Hill, let's keep figuring this out because you may end up stirring the hornet's nest if you make a wrong step?
I certainly think they're definitely looking at the various states and what they're doing. And because right now what you see is that patchwork of rules and regulations that each state has. California is different than Texas, than Florida, than Mississippi, than Massachusetts. And they're certainly taking a look at that. And, that's why where I'm working at Plus, we're taking a more evolutionary approach to this and figuring out what's the best commercialization route to avoid triggering those regulations in all those other states, while at the same time developing our product that we can make commercially available sooner rather than later. But what we've seen recently in California is that the bill that was working its way through the legislature, it passed the assembly almost unanimously. There were only 4 votes against it. But once it got to the Senate, it got into committee. And then what we've seen last week, the governor of California, Governor Newsom, announced that he was opposed to this legislation moving forward. And what the legislation would have done would have required a human in the cab at all times in these vehicles that are supposed to operate autonomously without a human in the cab, but it would have mandated that at all times the system operating, you must have somebody in the cab. But the governor reached out and made that statement that he was opposed to this legislation, and tacitly basically said that he would veto that if it moved forward out of the Senate.
That's what I was curious about, because my thought would have been California, you have San Francisco, a lot of areas for tech development, Silicon Valley. But at the same time, if you're a California governor, you also have labor and Teamsters and other stuff you're trying to work. Is that something where, for like even Governor Newsom saying, hey, I really don't like this, is that enough for a casual observer to say, okay, well, I should probably not really have to worry about this until maybe a next election cycle or a few years down the line?
I think, we'll keep an eye on it, but I think that has created a huge hurdle for moving that legislation forward. If it gets to the governor's desk and the governor vetoes it, is that something the Senate will do? If they do, then it will have to come back to the legislature for a possible veto override. And so we'll keep an eye on it and keep reaching out to those members of the Assembly and members of the Senate to voice our thoughts and our opinions on this legislation, and work to see where we go from there.
And I know that we have, I guess it's coming up almost, 2024 election season, people are ramping up. Is this the time when you're trying to influence policy? Does it, within these 4-year, 2-year periods, depending upon if you're the House or the Senate, is there a specific time where you really need to hit the gas and try to push for legislation? Or are these legislators typically, when it gets closer to it, they're not going to be as active because now you got to go out and try to get reelected and do all the stump speeches and all that?
Yeah, you nailed it right on the head on that one. That's exactly what happens. And right now is the time that you need to be very active in trying to pass any type of substantial legislation, because once you get into the latter half of the year, if it's not part of a funding bill, odds are it's not anything substantial isn't going to make it through the House and the Senate and then on to the president for signature. Just because presidential politics plays a lot into that, but you're also at the same time, you've got a third of the Senate that's up for re-election and the entire House of Representatives that are up for re-election. And politics, this is a big issue because, there's that perception there that, jobs are at stake, which is, if you look at all the studies, it is not the case. In fact, these new technologies will create jobs and also make the lives of those operating these vehicles better, safer, and easier. So it's just that perception that gets out there and that sticks with those elected officials that are looking to be reelected.
Well, they're worried because I can only imagine for some states, I think Walmart's one of the largest employers and also truck drivers. And I think that from what I've read, most autonomous systems are currently, if you're fully autonomous, it's a hub and spoke. So it's like an LTL, but the long haul segment is taken out. And that brings me to an interesting thing. Zoning regulations, Kodiak and Pilot had recently made, they have a truck port in Villa Rica, Georgia, outside Atlanta. And I'm curious where, even from Plus as a stance as well as what legislation, you had such a great point that from your experiences in Congress last time I spoke to you, some of the most effective folks were former developers. They just want to build things when we're talking about infrastructure. Is this something where it's split So we're focusing on the autonomous systems. I want to find a bill. I want to get attached to something to see if I can get across the finish line. Is anyone paying attention yet to the infrastructure, and will we need special zoning? Will we need special requirements for utilities or, locations? Is that something on the radar yet, or is it still front and center? Will the tech work?
Yeah, that's certainly something that both the Federal Highway Administration and the state departments of transportation are really looking into, and saying, okay, they've always been forward thinking in making sure that the infrastructure that they're building meets the needs of the future, because it's expensive to build these roads and bridges and other infrastructure. How do we meet the needs today, but also continue to meet them in the years to come? So folks at the Federal Highway Administration are already looking at how to shape policy in moving forward in creating these new roads and bridges and other infrastructure, but at the same time making them AV friendly. And this is where we work. Both those of us in my industry and others are working with the state DOTs and the Federal Highway Administration, which funds through our tax dollars road construction and repair and maintenance throughout the country.
And I'm curious about, I know with insurance, a lot of times insurance is up to the states when I talk to insurance providers for trucking, but for infrastructure, is it something where the federal administrations handle only the interstate system and then the states handle the bridges and highways everywhere else? Or how do you approach that? If you're trying to get autonomous friendly roads, what's the environment for a lot of folks? Because me being a casual observer, I'm just assuming the government just sends out like $700 billion. We're going to fix a bunch of bridges and somehow it just magically happens.
Well, what they do on the federal level is they set a set of parameters that a state must meet in the restoration, the repair, construction of new roads and bridges to meet certain specifications during that construction, so that it does have that longevity in the future. And when they're working in on these things, and the states are finding more and more that they're working with the private sector in public-private partnerships, like companies like Transurban, who we just announced a partnership with to do what you're talking about, where you use infrastructure to speak with autonomous trucks to make sure they're getting additional information beyond what they're seeing. These trucks that are being developed, level 4 drive route, are basically learning to drive like we do, like you and I do, what we can see around us, both in the distance and short range. But what if you had infrastructure that could transmit information to the vehicle and say, hey, 2 miles up ahead, the 2 left lanes are closed, so you need to move over. Watch out for animals that may be on the road, or traffic is building up ahead, and you can adjust that operation of that vehicle accordingly just from talking with infrastructure. And these are the types of things that not only on the national level the Department of Transportation is looking at and also targeting funds for, but on the state level, they're doing partnerships with the private sector to advance these things. Because if you look at what the trust fund, which funds these roads and bridges and everything else in transportation, there's fewer and fewer dollars that are coming into it, and it's funded by our gas taxes. And as a result, you have less flexibility. So they're doing more and more with the private sector.
I'm also thinking, I had a conversation with folks for tolling collection as well. That's one thing I'm wondering about, is since the fuel taxes, if we go to electricity, we go to other fuel sources, we're no longer getting that kind of big gas tax. are we going to have to find other ways to tax, whether it's through tolls, whether it's through sensors to show how many autonomous trucks? Because IFTA, well, if you're using an electric autonomous vehicle, battery electric, how are you going to handle that? So I'm pretty curious, is there specific things that we should keep our eye out for in terms of what would an autonomous friendly infrastructure package look like? Are we talking like huge amounts of sensors, 5G connectivity, or is it something like, I think of like a trolley, you just put a few lines in the ground and see if that's a way to help make sure it stays in its area?
Well, ideally, you would have proper lane markings and signage that the vehicles can interpret and read. That those would be the key things. But once you get beyond that, it's various sensors, maybe on existing light posts that are in urban areas, on signage, where you would want to see these types of new sensor technologies providing that information. And as for toll roads, that's certainly a way. I don't see, AV only lanes existing just because of political pressure and also how much room do you have to put those additional lanes, and how soon will those be utilized by are they going to be only truck only AV lanes, or are they going to allow for passenger cars? And how do you ensure proper utilization of that in order to get a return on investment? So I don't see in particular any AV only lanes in any large scale, but I know that one of the areas that Congress is looking at and DOT has looked at and various states have started the pilot programs is the VMT, the vehicle mileage tax, and how it's approached is varies among the various states. Is it you self-report your mileage, or as you register your vehicle, your mileage odometer is read at that time, and you owe, and maybe you pay over every quarter, every month, your taxes for that year. It just hasn't been decided yet. And then at the same time that you move to that alternative system like VMT, how do you wean the country off of the gas tax? And so that you're not double paying as you're driving down the road. Because as you said, with an electric vehicle, they're not paying anything in towards maintaining the roads, building new roads and infrastructure. And at the same time, they are typically heavier than a passenger car, gas-powered passenger car. So they're creating more damage to the roads just because of their weight. So we need to find out a way, as we're pushing towards that electrification of the vehicle industry, we need to look at a way to make sure that they're paying their fair share as we need to develop and improve our road infrastructure.
That's a great point. I don't think a lot of folks have considered. I wanted to shift gears while we have a little bit of time, the legal aspects as well. There's an interesting case, spoke with Matt Leffler a few weeks ago about Werner. They're appealing a $100 million verdict going to the Texas Supreme Court. But this was interesting that struck out with me was that a vehicle merged into the truck. The fault and stuff was determined, but at the same time, the carrier was being held liable for the damages, even though it was operating under, allegedly the FMCSA guidelines, considered safe, come in the lane of travel. Is there an instance, and I saw in San Francisco, it was a car, so this is obviously not a truck, but when you have self-driving vehicles get in accidents, what are some of the challenges and thoughts on Capitol Hill? And if you're looking at figuring out not only the deployment of these systems, but it almost feels like there's a whole other battle to say, what happens if something does go wrong? How do you tackle that?
I think we're all in a state of wait and see. That it's such a new technology, a new industry, and as it develops, we'll start seeing more data coming in. I think that's one of the things that the insurance companies want to see before they jump in full force and say we're going to invest in, we're going to insure all of these types of vehicles. They want to see the data coming in on crashes, crash avoidance, those types of things that they just don't have right now. And instances where, like you said, you brought up the Werner $100 million case. There are other cases that we've seen. There was a $1 billion case in Florida. There was another $400 million case. Again, these are with human-driven vehicles, but how do you assess insurance coverage on a vehicle that doesn't have a human behind the wheel while it's operating? And that's one of the and I'll reiterate one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing and approaching commercialization differently is we are taking our level 4 system and created a driver assistance system, a highly automated driver assistance system, so that we can collect data. And every time those vehicles are on the road, we are collecting that data and improving the driver assistance system. And at the same time, we're improving once further down the line when full autonomy occurs at scale, we'll be ready and the system will have proven itself not only to the public, to the regulators, but also to the insurance industry. And that's why companies like Bosch has partnered with us as their ADAS provider for commercial vehicles. So, and Nikola has selected us as their ADAS developer. So starting next year, all of the Nikola trucks will come standard with Plus Drive. So that's the approach we're taking to ensure and also to demonstrate that these technologies are safe and safer than a human driver. And by collecting and providing that data moving forward is a way to advance the technology.
Well, I think that's a good point. One thing that I'm just thinking of off the top of my head right now, we do hear a lot of calls for automated braking systems. There's a lot more push for having mandates in terms of safety. And so bridging that gap, is there an opportunity to provide the data? For example, detention time is being provided by an ELD provider, 80 carriers, 2,500 drivers. When we're looking at bridging it between theoretical to reality, is that kind of one of the plays as well for Plus, which is other autonomous ones will say, well, check it out, it's level 4 versus, hey, I'm here, I'm providing the data, here's your research study, I'm happy to share this with you. We're a stepping stone almost.
Yeah, and this is something that is, we're in dialogue with NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They issued a standing general order last year, and they are collecting some data, not necessarily all the data that they need to assess these new technologies, but we're in discussions with them. The industry is in discussions to ensure that they're collecting the data that they need again, we are an industry that is asking to be regulated. Not many industries request that, but we are, because we know that that's the path forward for this industry. And in those discussions with NHTSA, we want to make sure that the information that's provided isn't taken out of context. So this is the path moving forward. NHTSA has some other studies that are being done that will also assist in the assessment of these vehicles. You've got also working with insurance industry and making sure that they are aware of how the technology is developing and where it's progressing to.
And
so it's not just regulator, industry, insurance as well.
Got about a minute left for circling back to the legislative topic. It's almost like there's a window before election season. If we expect to see any movement from the DOT, Capitol Hill, FMCSA, how much time should we look at right now before it would be reasonably expected that, it's time to go get reelected now because an election's coming up? How much of a window do we have?
A very short window. I would say probably, if not end of October, maybe mid-November, because at that time they're focused on, after that, if they haven't passed, which I don't expect them to do, the appropriations bills necessary to fund the government. That's what their focus will be before the end of the year. And then starting in September. Now, actually, we've already started the presidential election season. It just gets more difficult the closer you get to the start of the new year. So I would say, but if it's not done by the end of October, it's challenging to get any significant rulemaking or legislation out.
Perfect. Wiley, thanks so much for your time. Folks want to learn more about Plus, get in contact with you, or just get caught up with what's going on in Capitol Hill. What's the best way to get in contact with y'all?
Yeah, you can. I'll give everybody my email address, wiley@plus.ai. And you can also go to www.plus.ai to visit our site. And you can also reach out to us through there.
Perfect. Wiley, thanks so much again. Always a pleasure talking to you. There's a lot going on, so we're going to keep our ear to the ground and watch these developments.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much.